Welcome back to Arguing with the Internet. On this week's episode, we're going to be exploring arguments about free will. What is it? Do we have it? Does it even matter? Right? In keeping with the format we've had for the last few weeks, we're going to be looking at actual arguments from the internet, reviewing them, making comments on both sides. Lewis, I think you have the first one.
Yeah, this one comes from Twitter. So we got two commenters here. The first one says, "Confession, I really have no idea what people are talking about when they talk about free will, and the more I read, the more confused I get. And I don't think it's just because it's a concept that perhaps has fuzzy edges." So this person's getting into how it's hard to define free will. It's hard to really know what people are talking about, and maybe people talk about it in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then this person responds, "Whatever the definition, I'll always say yes. I believe in free will. Either I'm right or I've been predestined that I believe in free will. So being wrong wouldn't be my fault." And so this person's making, almost like a moral argument for, it was good to believe in free will just because, you're kind of off the hook if free will isn't something that you actually have.
You couldn't have helped it, right? You were going to believe it,
right?
Regardless, yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because people don't usually make like a kind of, and I guess you want to believe stuff that's correct, but I don't know if you would go so far as to like, I don't know, this seems a little extreme, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange way of excuse making for sure, but there's interesting stuff in both of the portions of this like argument that you found. The first, the expression, I don't really know what's meant by free will. I don't know what exactly everyone's talking about. That is a confusion that, I mean, you see that in professional philosophy, like people who work on this stuff often have the same feeling, right? Because, well, to be quite honest, people use it in different ways. People use the notion of free will in different ways. Some people seem to mean something like, it is freedom from. So it's like freedom from coercion or something like that. I have free will so long as someone isn't, forcing me to do something that I did not want to do, right? Whereas other people, philosophers, will say, no, free will is some kind of like authorship of one's actions. Like a free will is having control of what you not only do, but maybe even want to do. Right, that last bit is a little bit controversial, but
right. So like the first definition you talked about, like when people say someone did something of their own free will, that would usually be an example of that. Like they weren't coerced.
They didn't have a gun to their head.
They were able to, They were able to like make the decision. So to the fullest extent that it's possible to make a decision as a person without being coerced. Whereas in the second case, it's saying something a little different, that like you were in control. It's not your brain. It's not the universe or your genes, the environment. It's like you as a person outside of all those things making a choice.
Yes. Yeah. And levels on that differ. Like the comment I made at the end of that proposition was that that might even require you to be the author of like your wants, not just your actions, but your like thoughts about those actions before they've been done, that kind of thing. That's somewhat controversial, right? Because there are some people who are going to argue you're not in control of that. Like you're not in control of the ideas that pop up in your head or like the motives that pop up in your head. But what you are in control of is whether or not you pursue those things, right? Whether or not you, sign off on the things that like perhaps your brain has provided you with, right? So not everyone thinks this idea of authorship requires total control, but there are some people who think that way. In any case, it's not strange to me that this person is confused about what free will is. It's
right.
It means a lot of things to a lot of different people.
Of course. Well, I think this might be a good time to actually get into some of the definitions and the positions that people have on free will. And since you've taught on this concept many times, I mean, you want to go ahead and give
Sure.
an overview
So
of that?
the first distinction to make when we talk about the common positions on free will, there are some uncommon ones. Maybe we'll touch on those later.
Mm.
The distinction that has to be made first is one between incompatibilists and compatibilists, right?
Mm.
You're going to like this. In order to understand the distinction, we have to understand another term, right? Don't you love those? Like, I'm going to tell you what this means after I tell you what two other things mean.
Right. That's philosophy for you.
That's philosophy for you, yeah. In order to understand the divide between the compatibilist and the incompatibilist, you need to know what determinism is, right? So determinism is this notion that the universe is this sort of closed system in which laws determine the outcomes of what will happen in the future, contingent on what happened in the past, right? So it's basic, like when people describe this, a lot of the time they just refer to it as like basic cause and effect or whatever, right? There's a cause, there's the law-like structure of the universe that determines the effect based on that cause, right? So the idea
It's
of
like
determinism,
a chain of dominoes, kind of like.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's
exactly.
the last
like
domino can't help
the
but fall over
dominoes.
because all the previous dominoes have fallen over.
Exactly. So in this context, determinism then just means that the world is structured that way, like a line of dominoes, right? And because of that, and because of the rigidity of the natural laws of the universe, what will happen, what is happening, what has happened, and what will happen is determined completely by former states of the universe plus the laws, right? So what is going to happen, including what I do, what you do, what I think, all of those things simply fall out of past events, right? They were determined to happen by these past events.
Right.
Okay.
So like an example of ways people think about that is, if someone, typically a demon is like how the thought experiment goes. If a demon knew everything that has ever happened and all the laws, they would be able to predict the future with 100% accuracy.
Right.
The future can't help but be the way the causal chain is going.
Right. Yeah, that's the idea of the Laplacian demon, this entity that is supposed to have unlimited like cognitive ability and therefore can, if given the proper information, what the laws of the universe are and what all has happened thus far, should be able to with 100% accuracy predict what happens next. Yeah. So now that we kind of understand what determinism is, we can move back to the distinction between compatibilists and incompatibilists. The incompatibilists want to say that free will cannot coexist with determinism, right? They want to say that if determinism is true, if our universe really is like that, there can be no free will. Whereas the compatibilists want to suggest that that isn't the case, that if determinism is true, we can still have free will. Before moving on to the back to the incompatibilists, there is a lot of controversy as to whether the compatibilists are even answering like the question that we seem interested in when we talk about free will in the first place, because the way they earn this notion that determinism does not defeat free will is by conceiving of free will, like we discussed earlier when we were speaking about the first portion of your response, by thinking of free will as merely being free from like coercion or something like that, right? So in their minds, right, it is the case that the universe is determined, right? Everything I think and ever will think, and everything I've done and ever will do, is a product of events that I had no control over, right? And I never will have any control over these things. Yet all the same, so long as no one comes in and like impinges on my desire to act a certain way, that's free, right? For the compatibilists. Whether or not that's
Right.
how most people think of free will is an open question. Um,
Right. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what everyone thinks free will is, but like, it seems that it's not that.
mm,
It's like the way people typically think of free will is being able to do something different given the same circumstances. Like if you're
uh-huh.
in a
Mm,
situation, you have multiple options in front of
good.
you, and maybe you could have chosen a different option. Um, but yeah, so to say that determinism, like there's this causal chain that determines everything that happens, including your decisions,
Uh-huh.
but also you have free will, like that just on its face seems
Yeah.
bizarre. But yeah, it is because, in many cases at least, they're changing or they're using kind of a limited version of free will that
Yeah.
makes it compatible. So maybe it's not the free will that's kind of worth having or worth
Hmm.
worrying about too much.
I like the way you put it. You described it as could do differently, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if determinism is true, it's not the case that you could have ever done differently, right? You'll never be in a position where, in the exact same context, you could do something different, right? You will always have done the same thing. That's what determinism
Mm-hmm.
is about. Okay, so the incompatibilists then, they both think there's two positions here. They both think that determinism and free will don't mix, like they cannot get along. Uh, there's like a positive position and a negative one. The negative position is called hard determinism, and they basically just
Mm-hmm.
say, well, that's true. Determinism and free will don't mix, but but determinism is true, right? So what happens? Well, free will, we've got to let go of it.
Right.
It's not true.
It's an illusion.
Right, exactly. Yeah. On
Yeah.
the other side of things, we have what are called the libertarians, not the political view. This is a libertarianism about free will, right?
Mm-hmm.
These people are the exact opposite. They say, yeah, if determinism was true, and that's a big if, free will wouldn't be possible. But determinism isn't true. So good for us, right? There's room for free will.
Right.
Um, those are more or less the main positions. There are some other
Mm-hmm.
ones that are slightly more esoteric, like you might believe that uh, God controls all things in a very like fine way, and that's not causal determinism, but it's
Mm.
probably not conducive to something like free will. Um,
Right. It's a kind of fatalism, maybe like certain
mm-hmm.
religions believe in. Yeah,
Exactly.
that God determines everything, so you can't act differently. But that's still not the same as like a causal chain. Especially like when we think
Mm-hmm.
of determinism, it's typically from like a scientific viewpoint.
Yeah.
Like if we understood all the physics and chemistry and all that, we'd be able to predict everything that's going to happen. Whereas if God's controlling that, it's a little
Right.
different.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a common mistake, at least when I've taught this kind of thing, I've seen this mistake over and over. To confuse determinism with something like fate, kind of like you were
Mm-hmm.
suggesting there. The major difference is that uh, if you are fated to do something, like if you have a fate to do something, it doesn't seem to really matter what all the background conditions were. Like things could have been differently, and your fate is still the same, right? Determinism doesn't work that way. Things, hypothetically speaking, could have been totally different. They could have been totally different if the laws of the universe had been slightly different, if the first things that happened, so like you've got the laws of the universe setting the framework, and then you have the first events happening in the world. Those get transformed through the laws and become new events and so forth, setting up the dominoes. But if those first things had been different, the end result would be massively different, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
Not so for a view like fatalism or a view that like goes in for a notion like fate. Uh, they seem to require that no, there's a specific end result, and you have to get there and will get there. That's not
Yeah, that's
quite true for the determinist.
suggests there's a kind of order where, like, if oh, I met you because it was fate that we met, or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, determinism's not going to give you that. It's just kind of like a random
Yeah.
universe doing its own
Yeah.
thing. Like,
It's more
no
like,
order.
well, because of the laws of the universe and everything that's happened prior to now, we were going to meet. Okay, that's way less
It's
fantastical
it's not
and
special. Yeah.
way less romantic than
Yeah.
we were fated to meet. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to talk about the response though? I think we've been a while on the what exactly is free will? What's going on with this notion?
Yeah. So I think as we sort of talked about, the people think about free will in different ways. So that's one reason why it's kind of confusing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this kind of belief that if you, well, let me just reiterate what the second person says. So they say, I believe in free will. So that means if I'm right, free will does exist, great. But if I'm wrong, then this person says they were predestined, but you could just think that, you had no choice to do otherwise, but to believe free will wasn't true. And so you're kind of off the hook there.
Right. So they've made the mistake we just talked about, basically.
Right. Predestination.
You're right. Right.
But I don't know. This seems like a weird way to go about things, like forming your beliefs in this kind of way of like, oh, if the universe is this way, then I'm right. If the universe is this way, then like it's fine that I'm wrong. It seems like a weird way to go about it. I mean, I don't know how many points you're getting for like being right in these like different possible world scenarios. Like,
yeah, it's a tricky thing. The idea that because it could be kind of spread to any kind of belief, right? Where you can say, so right now they're talking about free will, but you could use the same move in their context about anything. I'm gonna choose to believe that 2 plus 3 equals 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
If free will isn't real, I couldn't have helped that. And therefore, I'm off the hook. I'm excused, right? So either I'm right, or like I couldn't help it. It's like, okay, maybe. Like there is some truth to the fact that if determinism is true, this person says predestined, which, like we mentioned, is not the same thing. But let's be charitable.
Yeah, it's almost like they're sort of expecting like you die and you go meet God and you get points for all the right beliefs you've had or like the right positions you took or something. Like it's kind of a weird way to get to choose what to believe, I guess. But
also,
I mean, it's
like there's another way to come at this that I kind of want to approach. Like so to be clear, this is a bad move for like forming a belief. Like you should not do this. Because there is no independent reason for believing the thing. Like, I hope this person has other reasons for thinking that free will is true or is real over and above just this kind of like gamble that they're making. Because let's imagine the case in which there really is free will. I would want to argue, as someone who works on notions having to do with when it's right and wrong to form beliefs, right? I would want to suggest that this person still did something bad in terms of forming beliefs, right? Even if they were right and free will ended up being a thing, the method by which they got to that belief is still bad, right? It's still the case that they didn't earn this belief, right? They don't have real reasons for it. So even in their best case scenario, I'm not a fan,
It's almost like you could form a random belief that, I don't know, President Obama's using the bathroom right now. Like, I believe that. Like, it could
possibly
be true. I have no reason to believe that it's true. But, like, so it seems weird to say that, like, I get something out of being right just by happenstance.
Right.
Or because the method of me getting there was poor.
Yeah. It's this notion that there's some kind of value in like having gotten it right, even by like duplicitous means, like this shaky argument, for example, is kind of bizarre. It's kind of bizarre. So officially coming out as not a fan of this this wager move that this person is making.
I think that's a good time to move on to the next
sure. Argument. Okay, so this next one is a comment from Reddit. It's very short. In response to a question as to whether or not free will is real and why we should believe it is, this person simply responds, "It really, really, really seems like we have it." And that's it. That's the end. But while it's short, I do want to say, like, it's not altogether bad. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and say it. It's better than that wager argument we just saw. What this person is doing basically is saying that we have this extremely strong intuition that free will is a thing. I hear a lot of people say this, that as they're walking about in their day-to-day lives, it seems like they have control. Like they have at least some ability, if not complete ability, they have some ability to dictate what they do, the choices they make. At the very least, they have the ability to to choose between options presented to them by like their subconscious or their brains or something like that, right? They have some amount of control. That seems to be like a common intuition, right? It's just this feeling that you can't shake, right? It's a feeling that you can't shake. Some people...
Well, I'd say, that's my sort of intuition, is that people do often think they have free will, not just like in the sense that like he did it of his own volition, but we can make choices. We have the possibility to choose differently. But I do wonder if this is always true. Like if, for instance, you grew up in an environment where determinism was something that was taught to you, would you have the same intuitions? And I wonder, like, there's cross-cultural differences, because I know that different religions have different, as we talked about, some of them have this kind of predestination idea.
Yeah.
And there's things about the mind that have been intuitions for a long time that, Freud had this controversial idea, or like this revolutionary idea, that there's an unconscious mind. There's things that come to you that are not conscious. Whereas before, maybe people thought that pretty much everything you do is conscious. Every action you make has a conscious component. So
sure,
there are ways that we can, on the one hand, maybe the intuition isn't always like necessarily going to be there, and on the other hand, like just because we have these intuitions doesn't mean they're right, because we have intuitions about other mental processes that have turned out to be wrong.
Yeah, that's where I was gonna go. Is that even if you can like agree. So you made some interesting points that the intuition might not be as universal as it seems, right? It might depend on like your upbringing, et cetera, et cetera. There are there are studies that have found that intuitions that seem like pretty universal, they do tend to kind of drift with cultural difference. I don't know about this case specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised. But more importantly, like the last point you made, that's exactly where I was going to go. Is that even if this were a universal intuition, it's still not clear that buys you anything in terms of like confidence in the things being true, right? As you said, historically, we've had all kinds of intuitions that have ended up being false, right? Intuition is no doubt like an important part of the reasoning process. You have to start somewhere. You can't just start doing inquiry out of nothing, right? It typically requires some kind of intuition to kickstart things. But to end there, to end the reasoning process on an intuition, it seems suspect, right? It seems like maybe you should do some footwork before you rest on your laurels, having saved the notion of free will, for example.
Right. And that's, having taught psychology classes in grad school, like, learn a lot about how, people hate on psychological research or any kind of social science research a lot.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I'm sure we're going to do an episode on this eventually, but one of the reasons is because, it's obvious. Like it's one thing I used to do is go to like the science subreddit and just like get mad at people saying like, oh, why did they do this study? This is obvious. Like everyone knows
sure.
that, this sort of psychological phenomenon happens or something.
Right.
But people have these intuitions about how your beliefs work, how different cognitive processes work, but they're often very wrong. And so even if like, a study supports like the common sense thing, like you never know.
Mm-hmm.
But also people are, can sort of skew data to like fit whatever kind of ideas they have about cognition. Like maybe the ideas we have about cognition are a little more malleable, and we just kind of like whatever we hear, we sort of make that work with our intuitions. But I think people think they know a lot about how the mind works because everyone has thoughts and feelings, beliefs, and all this stuff. But I think we really don't know that much. Or we're not really the experts that we think we are.
Right.
And a lot of social science research has supported that.
There's a clear difference between a feeling of understanding and actual understanding. And I think that's an important thing to note when you're talking about intuitions here. Even if you have a powerful intuition, like one that you can't shake, it's still really no like guarantee of any kind of truth. Right. I don't want to say that they count for nothing. They might, intuition might lead you some of the way there.
It does shift the burden of proof to an extent. Like if you want to say that you have a belief that goes completely against people's intuitions, then it takes more. Yeah, it's not enough usually just to say like your intuition is dumb, like or it's based on faulty reasoning. Right. You also have to come up with a replacement theory that explains why the intuition doesn't work.
Right. Which is perhaps not great, right? Because it's more or less like noting that confirmation bias exists, right? You're proposing something that runs counter to what I believe currently, even though if it's belief by intuition, that just by definition means you don't have any reasons for it, aside from your feeling, your gut feeling. You disagree with that gut feeling, you're going to have to do more work to convince me. That just is confirmation bias, right?
Right. But I think of it as like, when people were atheists before like the theory of evolution or many of our modern scientific theories, I feel like it was much harder because people would, ask then like, okay, well, like how did everything get here? Or like, how did humans get here? Like all this stuff. And you're just like, I don't know. I just think like the arguments you have for creationism are bad.
Right.
It doesn't mean they're wrong to, have those beliefs that creationism like isn't true, for instance. But then if you have a kind of replacement theory, it's a little easier pill to swallow. And I think the same is true for free will, where now we have a greater understanding of, for instance, like psychology and neuroscience and instances where people are not as in control as they think they are. So it's a little easier to make the case. And I think that's why, maybe this, I don't know if it's a more recent phenomenon, but it definitely seems like people are more likely to believe free will isn't true.
I see where you're coming from. This idea that like, well, now that we know so much more, it's kind of like now that we know so much more about psychology, neuroscience, etc., we now know that we don't know a lot, right? When it comes to the way our minds work. And that knowing that you don't know very much about how your mind works does kind of lend itself towards weakening that intuition of like free will, right? But importantly, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? In order to get free will, it's not the case that you need every single action, desire, whatever, to be completely free, right? If you can find even one instance, just one instance of an occasion in which you had a choice that you could have done otherwise, right? You really could have done other than what you ultimately chose. That was a free act, and therefore free will is a thing. You don't even need another to ever happen again, right? So just because we can find some areas like in psychology or neuroscience, I mean, I know there are some studies, for example, that suggest that like decision making is done before the conscious mind is even aware of like the problem. I
Hmm.
think yeah, there's a famous book called The Illusion of Conscious Will that gathers all of these experiments that make these kind of their conclusions kind of suggest as much. Um, but even if that sort of thing is true on average, like I said, really you only need one instance of a truly free act, and you've saved free will. Um,
Right. That's true. Yeah. So it could be, perhaps it could be rarer than people think it is. Like
mm-hmm.
based on people's intuition.
Exactly.
Like I said,
Exactly.
people used to think, or were more likely to think that everything they did was consciously chosen, and now we have a greater appreciation of the limits of conscious
Right. We know about biases
awareness.
and things like that now.
But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that it's completely out the window. Like you could still have free will, just
Right.
in more limited situations, perhaps.
Right. Okay. Do you want to move on to your next argument?
Yeah, I think this is a good bridge since we were just talking about neuroscience a little bit.
Okay.
So this is from Twitter. This person says, "We don't know anywhere near enough about the brain to rule out libertarian free will. People assume determinism because it fits the scientific zeitgeist of our times, not because we have strong evidence that it's true."
Mm.
So this person's claiming that determinism is, he says it fits the scientific zeitgeist, so it's a popular idea among scientists and people who claim to be like scientifically minded,
Mm-hmm.
which may be true. I don't know exactly.
It was certainly
But
true in like the times of Newton, right? Where the
mm,
universe was seen through classical mechanics.
right. Yeah,
But
I could see, just in terms of like what, if you polled a bunch of scientists, what they would say. I don't know about that exactly.
yeah, that would be
Um,
interesting. It's interesting to me that this person says like it's because we don't know near enough about the brain that we can't rule out free will, right? And then they go on to question the legitimacy of determinism.
right.
Um, Determinism and our knowledge of the brain, like advances in neuroscience, aren't really going to be that strongly related. Like the power of determinism is
Mm,
not in saying something like uh, unconscious forces or some machinations in the brain that you are not in control of are actually responsible for decision making. That's one way to attack free will, but that's not the standard deterministic way, which says the universe works like clockwork, right? It's sure your brain is a part of it, but yeah, I don't know. So it's strange to me they're singling out the
yeah.
brain here.
So you're suggesting that neuroscience and even psychology, any kind of science, I guess, isn't necessary to get determinism, or at least isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessary to rule out libertarian free will.
Right.
Um, which yeah,
Maybe they're
I
just
agree with that.
yeah. Maybe
Because
they're just making 2 points though. Like maybe they're making a point kind of like the one we just made, wherein we said, like uh, we've made some advances in neuroscience and psychology, and some of those advances make us question our intuition about free will. But at the same time, uh, we don't know everything there is to know about those things. And really, the libertarian about free will just needs one instance. So we still can't rule it out, even though we have more understanding now. Maybe that's what they mean by this first point. And their next point is just like sort of
right,
separate, where they attack
yeah,
the
the
notion
first
of
point could
determinism.
be people that uh, try to find instances where decisions weren't as free as they were, as people think they are, based on what's happening in their brain. That maybe they're saying you can't rule it out in all cases, even if you can rule it out. So they're kind of giving a little bit of legitimacy to the method of inquiry of like looking at the brain
Mm-hmm.
to study free will. But I mean, um, I'm a neuroscientist, and I think people often give too much credit to neuroscience.
Okay.
It's just kind of a weird thing for me to say, but because I think neuroscience doesn't have that much to say about the free will debate, honestly.
Mm.
Um, a lot of the experiments that have been done in neuroscience to try to get a handle on whether free will exists or not, basically have to do with looking at some kind of activity in the brain. And some people have demonstrated that when someone makes a conscious choice, there seems to be activities happening in their brain. That's, if they're trying to make a conscious choice to move, for instance, there's activity in like the areas that control movement that happens before the person decides to move. So that suggests that like the movement's already happening before they're aware of it. And there's, a lot of different ways to interpret those experiments. But I think the main thing is, the main criticism of a kind of free will from like a scientific perspective is just, if you didn't have neurons controlling behavior and controlling your psychological states, then like, how does that work? Like as a scientist, you typically think of like a causal chain where, if physical structures interact in a certain way, you get like a chemical reaction. And if and you bring that up to different levels of analysis. So in the case of neuroscience, if you have a person who's happy one minute and they're sad the next minute, their brain is going to be different. It would be, from that perspective, it would be impossible for their brain structure and their brain function to be exactly the same because they have two different psychological states. And those are completely dependent on what's happening in their brain. And so I don't think you need, so just from like a theoretical perspective, you have a case against free will that you don't need like experimental data necessarily to come to.
There's a lot to say there. So like you've spoken on like the neuroscience side. There's a lot to say there on the philosophical side of things. In fact, so much that I'm not sure we can get into it here.
Right.
I'll just say, it's like a small comment. I'll say the notion that the brain and the mind are so intimately tied is not universally shared by any means amongst philosophers who work on this kind of thing, right? There are some who even acknowledge the connections, that psychological states seem to differ in accord with neurological states and vice versa. And still have some decent explanations for how they can navigate around that without making the perhaps reductive claim that that entails that one is the other, right? That mental phenomena just are like expressions of things going on in the brain. But that has to do with like philosophy of mind. And while it would be interesting, it would be a very long conversation.
Right. I mean, that is definitely a detour. But I mean, the case I was trying to make in general is I don't think you need like a study using neuroscientists to like debunk free will or to prove that there is free will, just because I think the assumptions that people have in doing neuroscience, like behavioral neuroscience, psychological, cognitive neuroscience, those themselves are kind of the ammunition you need.
I see. Okay. What seems to be doing more work for them here in the actual bit of the argument is there is an argument here, even though it's short, is more or less to suggest that determinism is not as easily won as many people seem to think that it is, right? So you can't just, in the same way that we've said, you can't help yourself to the notion of free will, like when we saw that first argument where the person was trying to suggest that they can believe in free will without any consequences for themselves. And like we saw with the second argument where it's, well, I'm going to choose to believe because it's intuitive to me, right? In both cases, it seems like you haven't really like earned the belief, and that's what's wrong. Well, the same kind of move could be employed against the determinist, right? It's not okay to just go around saying, well, of course the universe is that way. Why wouldn't it be that way? You got to have some reasons for thinking that. And if you can't supply those reasons, then you probably shouldn't go around saying free will is false or not real because determinism is true. So yeah, there is something to that move. Now, like you were hinting at, it's not clear like how many scientists today are determinists. I do think at some point in history, certainly most, if not all of them were, just because of the way we understood physics at the time. But nowadays, it's not so clear.
I mean, like of that time in the the Enlightenment or whatever. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
most of the scientists were still religious, and so
That's true.
I mean, some of them were like more deists, where they believed like God set everything up.
God sets the
to
rules,
act
and that's it.
right,
Mm-hmm.
but not all of them. And but, some of that's just it was like impossible to not be religious at the time, basically. But
Right,
I
for
can
fear
imagine
of
like
social persecution. Yeah.
yeah, I would imagine a lot of them were like truly religious and believed a lot of
Yeah.
that doctrine, which is very distinct from that mechanistic version
Mm-hmm.
of the universe. So I'm not sure.
Well, in any case, whatever the historical fact of the matter is,
Mhm.
it's not clear today, especially, I would say, whether that it's true of all scientists or a majority of them that they are determinists. One thing that philosophers like to point to when they're talking about whether determinism is true or not are quantum phenomena. Phenomena that
Mhm.
seem to escape this notion of, well, because this happened prior to it, and the laws of the universe are set in stone, this thing must happen after. Right? It seems like I'm no expert, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt or two.
Mhm.
But it seems that there are some phenomena that can't be, like the outcomes of which can't be predicted ahead of time. They can be assigned perhaps probabilities. We can maybe deduce the uh, possible outcomes of a certain cause. Um, but which one of those outcomes will come to manifest, at least in some cases, seems to be not completely determined. At least that's the line that philosophers making this move try to sell.
Right. Quantum physics, it does seem to throw a wrench in the idea of like what we talked about before, the Laplacian demon,
Mm-hmm.
uh, an entity that could know everything that's happened before, know all the physical laws, and predict
Yeah.
with 100% certainty what's going to happen in the future. Yeah, if there are truly random events, and even in a large scale, they might be highly probabilistic. You can determine, 10% of cases this is going to happen, 80% this is going to happen, or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't determine every single case, then things are going to be slightly different over
Mm-hmm.
time. And so, yeah, maybe you can't have that kind of determinism, but at the same time, like the 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 meat of the argument for determinism against free will doesn't really matter if you can predict everything absolutely certainly. um, it just matters that everything happens through physical means or through some other means of the universe operating in a causal fashion
Mm-hmm.
that's something like free will is incompatible with. Well, if you're an incompatibilist. So it doesn't
Right.
matter if some of it is random. It just still doesn't leave room for
Yeah.
this kind of freedom.
Yeah, that's kind of the problem that I've always had with this move. Even if the universe isn't deterministic because of something like quantum phenomena, that doesn't really like grant you easy access to free will straight away as a result, right? Perhaps it makes it less of a certain thing that free will is doomed or something, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not like it opens the door. It doesn't invite the notion in. Because if the universe, let's say, is partially determined by laws and the things that happened before, and partially is just random, there still doesn't look like there's much room there for this notion of free will, at least where like we are in control, like we have agency is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Randomness isn't free, right? Randomness is randomness. It's not directed. Um,
Right.
I'm not. I think it's even with my limited knowledge, I think it'd be a mistake to say that quantum phenomena are like somehow supposed to be random. But um, still, even with a more like nuanced understanding, I don't think it opens the door for this notion of this radical agency that most libertarians about free will want.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I obviously don't know much about quantum physics either, which almost everybody can say, but like it doesn't stop me from talking about it. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you're right. It doesn't really grant too much. I think people often, if there's an intractable problem, like a philosophical issue that people have been going back and forth with for a long time, if there's like a weird new phenomenon, like new physical phenomenon that comes out, people just want to latch onto it and say, oh, like maybe this is it. Maybe quantum phenomena explain consciousness. Maybe they explain free will. Maybe they explain all these other problems, which maybe there's something there, but I don't know. At its face, at least, I don't really buy that line of argument.
At the very least, though, it might stave off temporarily the assault against free will, by the determinist. But in the end, it's not going to do the job of motivating the position. It's just going to do the job of preventing it from immediately crumbling, which is not nothing.
Right.
But before we move on, I want to restate that there is something to this, right? The determinism can't simply be assumed, right? You're going to have reasons for believing in it.
Right. I do think people might overstate the extent to which science can tell us about free will, either for or against. So I think there are a lot of philosophical, metaphysical assumptions that people make that they want to just say it's like, oh, this is what the science says, but it's really just a philosophical position, basically.
Right. Okay, I think we've got one more.
Yeah.
This one I have pulled from Reddit. This person is making a comment in response to a post wherein the poster was wondering whether or not the issue of free will was irrelevant altogether, for similar reasons to the first argument we saw from you. Where it's like, well, if free will is a thing, fine. If it isn't, I couldn't have helped but think otherwise. So what's the point in thinking about it? Right?
Right.
This person is responding to that line of thought. It's fairly long, so bear with me. If a computer does something that is wrong, we either try to fix the computer or prevent it from harming other computers, people, by quarantining it. We repair it or prevent it from doing it in the future. If people don't have free will, our legal system should be organized much in the same way. People have no choice in their actions and have a genetic potential to do them, which is actualized by their circumstances. There is a diathesis for an action. This is coming from a philosophy Reddit, if you were wondering. And the stress that triggers it. Since people are not responsible for their actions, because they couldn't have acted otherwise, we should only try to fix them or prevent them from harming other people by quarantining them. We repair them or prevent them from doing a similar action in the future. On the other hand, if people do not have free will, if people do have free will, if they truly have choice in their actions, then they are morally responsible for what they do. Consequently, it seems that rather than just reparative and preventative factors, we also add in a punitive one. This person deserves to be punished because of what they did. They deserve to feel the pain they caused because they truly had the choice to cause that pain. Hence, the truth value of free will plays a huge role in how we look at our legal system. Okay, all that said, what this person is doing is saying that the argument about free will is not irrelevant. It's not unimportant. And that's because it's going to be crucial, at least in their minds, in determining how we approach our moral and, as a consequence, legal systems, right? They paint the picture in terms of a dichotomy. On one side, free will is not a thing. On the other, it is. So on the understanding that free will is a legitimate notion, it's true, and people do have a choice in terms of what they do, it seems like we have the ability to hold people personally responsible, right? You did this bad thing, and you chose to do this bad thing, right? So we can now, seek justice against you or something like that, right? It kind of facilitates this idea of justice. Retribution also becomes possible.
Right.
At the same time, you could also think of it in a more positive way. If free will is a thing, then when someone does something remarkably kind or good, that's because they chose to. So those kinds of actions are genuinely praiseworthy, right? This person chose to do these good things. They chose to be a good person. They didn't have to. They could have acted otherwise, but they did. Now, run it the other direction, where free will is false, right? Suppose determinism is true and they're incompatible. Well, now, it's simply the case that people could not have chosen to do otherwise. They're going to do what they were determined to do. And so it becomes kind of tricky when deciding whether or not we can hold people responsible, right? Whether or not we can actually judge other people now, either in a good way or a bad way, for what they do, because we know they could not have chosen otherwise. Some people, in fact, argue that no matter the truth of the matter, we should choose to believe in free will, because without it, our moral systems fail.
Yeah, I think you raised a lot of interesting points there. Yeah, the issue of free will does have a lot of bearing on, how we hold people accountable for their actions, and our, institutions like prisons designed to seek vengeance or punish people. Yeah, they don't really make sense in a determinist world where free will does not exist, except, as you said, maybe, if everyone believed we didn't have free will, maybe that would ruin our society in some way, or people would be more likely to act immorally if they didn't believe in free will. And so maybe even if determinism is true and it's incompatible with free will, maybe it's the better thing morally is to believe free will is true, or operate as if free will is true.
Right. That's not an uncommon move. For some, there are a group of utilitarians, for example, who believe that to be the case. We talked about them when we discussed whether or not it was morally okay to eat animals. If you're interested in learning more about utilitarians.
Yeah, but I think one thing this commenter, one point they made in the first paragraph, they're talking about what happens if we don't believe in free will, how that affects, we should, if we think about people as computers or some other entity that operates completely mechanically,
Right.
they can't help but do what it does. So, if a computer is malfunctioning, this person says, we prevent it from harming other computers. Maybe we try to repair it, or we at least quarantine it. But that's not necessarily the case with people. I mean, you certainly could have that way of thinking about people, like we rehabilitate people who have done moral transgressions because they couldn't help it, or we at least isolate them. But you could also just kill them. I mean,
Yeah.
like if a computer is malfunctioning, it's harming other computers, for instance. You might just get rid of it, or you might salvage it for parts. You don't necessarily have to quarantine it or repair it, and you could make the same argument for people as well.
Yeah, I mean, the response is kind of like a flippant one in its mode of presentation. But one thing that sometimes comes hand in hand with a radical acceptance of determinism is a devaluing of things that might typically thought to have inherent value. For example, like the significance of human life, right? Like if everything is simply plodding along according to the natural laws of the universe and the things that came before us, well, then there's nothing really significant about us. We're just another cog. We're just another piece in the machine, right? And if you have that kind of view, then yeah, you're right. Even though, yeah, I mean, you're right. If that kind of view also falls out of determinism, then maybe the easiest way to deal with transgressions is to like ensure they don't happen again, right? In whatever means.
Right, but
But
humans are different than computers, and
mhm,
there's other things. Even if I guess you could still have a deterministic and incompatibilist worldview and still think that you should respect the dignity of human life,
exactly.
or
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going.
treat people with
Yeah.
respect, because they can suffer, unlike computers as far as we know,
Mhm.
and so they have a different moral status.
Right. So determinism, well, I could understand how it could lead to a worldview in which some things are devalued, like human life, for example. It doesn't fall out of it necessarily. You could be a determinist and still think that there's like maybe even inherent sanctity or value to human life. Um, but while this person is certainly eloquent, the thing that stands out to me about this move they're making is that I don't understand why the other sides couldn't simply be switched. So I'll explain more. They're acting as though it's only the case that we should care about why people did what they did and treat them as something to fix rather than something to punish
Mhm.
if determinism is true. But you could easily have that view and still think that free will is a thing, right?
Mm.
You could think that the proper way of dealing with moral harms or transgressions is to identify why this person did what they did. And if you believe in free will, maybe part of that is talking to them, figuring out what their decision process is like, where it comes from, that sort of thing, right? Um, so and the same can be said in the other direction as well. So he states that if free will is the case, then um, we are suddenly allowed to bring retribution back in, right? Because now we can hold people responsible, and therefore we can use retribution or issue out justice, that sort of thing. Well, the determinists could feel that way too, right? We've talked about consequentialists several times now, right? And as I've said before, largely speaking, the consequentialist doesn't care about uh, whether or not you're a good or bad person. They care about good or bad actions, right? Whether or not the consequences of your actions were good or not.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
I
they
think it's
could, yeah,
well, sorry to jump in, but
that's okay.
yeah, I think you made a couple interesting points there. So I wanted to touch on one where, yeah, if you have a universe where there is free will, you can still change people's behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not that you have determinism or you have randomness in the case of free will. Like
Mm-hmm.
if someone chose to murder, they may have
Mm-hmm.
had logical, rational reasons for doing so that could be changed by either argument or by maybe putting them in some kind of rehabilitation program
Mm-hmm.
to change the way they consider things. So
Exactly.
even in that case, you do have free will. It's not that you should just punish people who do bad things and uplift people who do good things. Like there could still be
Right.
some room for
In
changing
fact,
the environment.
it might even be like more effective if free will is true, because you are acknowledging the possibility of this person deciding to do differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just is what it means to have libertarian free will. So in making that declaration, this person could have and can choose to do differently. Um, you're also in effect saying that they can improve, right? They can be better if they choose to be. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if determinism is true, that doesn't necessarily follow. It might be the case that there are some individuals that cannot be, uh, quote unquote, fixed in this way, right?
Mm.
So you might be even more on the hook for this line of thinking in regards to justice and morality if you think free will is a thing. So I
Yeah.
understand where this person is coming from, but I don't think the dichotomy they set up is um, exactly as strict as they seem to think it is.
Right. And it may also be misleading to to have this like completely different set of scenarios for determinism versus free will, because you can have maybe more of a mix of both. Like even people that do believe in free will, as we've mentioned, maybe free will only occurs in certain specific scenarios. And so I think most people are going to acknowledge that circumstances play a role in someone's behavior. So if someone was traumatized as a child and they had no resources and no they just had a really hard life, and weren't set up to thrive, they're gonna if they commit a crime, you might feel that those circumstances kind of mitigate that a little bit, so they shouldn't be punished as much, or they should be trying to help them rather than to punish them. Whereas someone that comes from more privilege and had more opportunities for success and everything for them, and they commit the same crime, like maybe you would be harsher on that person. So even if in that case they do have free will, there are still external circumstances that make it harder for one person to do the right thing over another.
Right. Yeah, and to go back in the other direction again, it's totally possible for a determinist to even think we should seek retribution against people who do wrong. A determinist who readily acknowledges that people could not have done differently might say something like, if we use something like retribution against wrongdoers, there might be something like a deterrence factor against wrongdoing by others, for example. And therefore the consequences make it such that it's a good thing to do. So I think on both sides, this person has not made their point sufficiently that our moral systems are going to completely fall one way or the other depending on this question, right? Would this question be relevant in some respects to like moral questions? Sure, that seems to be the case. But will it be the end all be all to help us decide how we should treat like wrongdoers, or even those who do exceptional good? I'm not convinced.
Right. Yeah, I mean, on its face, the free will versus like hard determinism, it seems like it has a huge impact on like our legal system, or like a lot of the ways that we operate in society. But maybe other circumstances can play a huge role as well, like our ethical positions, for instance. And so maybe it's not as cut and dry as it may seem initially.
Right.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up.
Whoa. Do we have free will?
Well, I think like most episodes, we probably didn't really answer the the titular question. But there's a reason people have been having this debate for since ancient Greece, or whenever people started deciding, it's thousands of years. It's complicated to define what free will is in the first place. It's complicated to know one way or the other. Science probably won't save us, so we're just going to keep having this debate probably. But.
Yeah. Well, the goal of these episodes is, I think it's less to deliver like a verdict on the question we ask, and more to help others explore the problem space, right? So hopefully now, like even though we didn't really answer the question, hopefully now you have some idea as to where you fall and what that might mean in terms of like implications and what's going to be required of you in order to make the arguments that you'll need.
Right.
But yeah, as always,
that's all we can do.
There's way more to say, but we're running along. So I think that'll be it until next time.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time.